bit about healing from time to time. We all need healing. We just went through a prayer list with a lot of people in need of healing for sure. I'm no stranger to healing in my life either. I've had numerous medical operations, none recently, thankfully. When I was younger, when I had most of them, I've had ear operations. I've had my wisdom teeth taken out, which they put you under for that. I even had my finger shut in a car door one time. That was not fun. So that actually didn't require an operation or surgery, but it required substantial healing. And in the passage that we're going to look at this morning, Jesus unexpectedly arrives in this town called Gennesaret, and he is there prepared to heal people. If you read Mark the whole way through, which we're going to pick it up in chapter 6, but if you do, you would notice that when this happens, it was literally just yesterday that Jesus fed 5,000 men with 2 fish and 5 loaves. And then in Mark, with their bellies full apparently, Jesus sends his disciples away by sea. And it is significant because Jesus directs them to sail towards the town of Bethsaida. But I'll get to that shortly. They don't arrive in Bethsaida, which is very important. But when all that's going on, Jesus, though, doesn't take the trip with them. He hangs back, and he does so that he can spend some serious time in prayer by himself. And he can do that without being distracted either. So that's a little mini lesson inside the lesson where we should set that time aside on a regular basis. But in the story, night falls and a storm gets stirred up. And Jesus sees his disciples in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, which if you know anything about smaller bodies of water, when there's a storm, the waves tend to rock even more and even higher than larger bodies of water do. Some scientific things going on with that I don't understand, but that's what they tell us anyway. And that's when Jesus goes out onto the sea and walks to them on the water. And quite a miracle for sure. Some people have different ideas of what it means to walk on water. I heard this story of a guy, we'll just call him Joe, I guess. While growing up, his grandmother always told him the story that he comes from a long line of men able to walk on water. On their 21st birthdays, his father and his grandfather, separately of course, had walked on water. So Joe thought, this is my turn. I'm going to be 21 soon. I'm not going to be the odd man out. So on his 21st birthday, he rows out onto a small lake. And it's pretty hot, July afternoon, let's say. And he says, okay, here we go. He steps overboard and guess what? Sinks to the bottom. No surprise there. He can't figure it out. He angrily climbs back into the boat, rows back to shore, goes back to his grandmother and says what happened. He says, how come they were able to do it and I wasn't? And she says, don't you remember your father and grandfather were both born in January? So obviously the lake was frozen over, and they call that walking on water. We know it's, taking some liberties there with the words for sure. Now, unlike that somewhat comical story of Joe and sinking to the bottom, Jesus's feat of walking on water was the real thing. But his disciples didn't know what to make of this, and I wouldn't either. I'd never seen anybody do that in my whole life either. And if you were on the boat with them and you see this happening and the storm is raging and Jesus are walking on the water, things start to really get serious. You're thinking, okay, yesterday we fed all these people with just a small boy's lunch. And really, when they say Jesus fed 5,000 men, it makes sense. It probably was in excess of 10,000, maybe 15,000. If the average guy there had a wife and a child, maybe, on average. I mean, not everybody, but it was a lot of people were fed with that miracle. And they said, that's what happened yesterday. And now today, Jesus is defying physics because in all of our lives, we always see a dense object falls into the water, it sinks. Jesus should sink, and he's not. So something really serious is going on here. And in probably a 24-hour period, the lives of his disciples were turned upside down by this man. It's like everything you thought you knew before, thrown overboard, and not, pardon the pun on that, but completely changed their whole lives. They had this combination of excitement, I'm sure, and fear too. The Bible says they were scared. And for instance, I've had times in my life where I've been excited and scared at the same time. Back in seminary, they have us practice preaching. And the very first time I stood up in front of my class, I was excited and I was terrified too. I never did anything like this before. Not a naturally gifted speaker, and that probably shows through quite often. But maybe you have your own experience where you have been excited and scared at the same time. Maybe it's like riding a roller coaster for the first time. You're excited, but you're also fearful. That's awful high up there, and I don't like being upside down and all that kind of stuff. I have a sense the disciples felt something like that. And that is where we are going to begin with, for some reason, my mistake. I do this every now and then, and I apologize. The words are not going to be on the screen because I have a couple different versions of my slides, and my mistake. I must have saved it under the wrong heading, so I'll just read it out of the NIV. This is what I would have had up there anyway. We're going to look at Mark 6, verses 53 to 56. And reading in the NIV, it says, "When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed." May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. It's a very short part of a very long chapter. And so if what the disciples expected to come to pass had come to pass, they would have landed in Bethsaida, that small town. And in that case, the people in Gennesaret who ended up being healed would have remained in their sickness and illnesses. But that wasn't the will of God. In hindsight, we can see that Jesus wanted them in Gennesaret, so my battery might be going to... All right, I'm going to talk louder. So what I was saying, that wasn't the will of God, though, for the people in Bethsaida. It was for the people in Gennesaret at this time and place to be healed. So Jesus knows that the storm is coming in a certain direction. So he has them push more eastward. That way, the storm pushes them to where he really wants them to go to begin with, is basically what's happening. And that's what I'm trying to describe here. And how often do we see that happen in our lives, where we rarely notice God's work while it's happening? It's in hindsight we see things come together. Sometime later we see, oh, this event and that event and something else were working together, and I thought things were really bad, and they were actually working towards something really good. And I don't know if you're like me, sometimes you just sit back and you wonder, with all of the bad choices I've made in my life, somehow things still sort of turned out pretty much okay. And I attribute that all to God, to his word. And maybe you're going through something right now today, and it's not what you planned at all. Do you believe that your situation is in God's hands? Maybe God's directing you through a storm so that you will end up where he wants you to be and not where you intended to be. And I would urge you to consider it prayerfully as you seek God's guidance through that storm. And make no mistake about it, if Jesus wanted to, in Mark chapter 6, he could have just told the disciples, sail to Gennesaret, and he could have stopped that storm before it started, and he could have accomplished his will there too. But he had a purpose for that storm, but he didn't allow that storm to change his will and what he wanted to come to pass. For me, just when I start trying to wrap my mind around this, it just puts me so much more in awe of God and his whole plan in the world. They learned that Jesus, God, is in control no matter what happens. The storms of life do not signify the absence of God in the world. They actually signify his presence in the way that he gets us through them and out of them. So maybe there's another way I can put it, related to farm life. Perry County, a lot of farms out here. A little chicken in an egg. Little chick is trying to get out, okay? It thinks it's time to be born now. And so what it'll do, it will peck at the inside of that egg with its beak. And it'll try to, of course, crack that eggshell because it thinks I'm ready to be born. Sometimes it'll start and then stop. And if a well-intentioned person sees this, they think, oh, little chick trying to get out, I'm going to help it. And I'm going to just break that little egg a little more and help it. A lot of times they'll end up killing that chick by doing that. I didn't realize this until recently. One of two things could happen, or maybe both of them can happen. First, if the chick comes out too quickly, then there's this really, honestly, gross kind of a moist sac around the chick inside the egg. And if that dries too quickly, then it's going to be like its feathers will be pasted to it and it won't be able to move and it can't get food and it'll die pretty soon. The other thing is that God put in the nature of the chick the fact that that pecking motion is very important. That helps strengthen its muscles. And until it's ready to get out of that egg, maybe it needs more strengthening. So in a couple ways, it can possibly harm or even kill that chick if we try to get it out of the egg before it is ready. And it's how it is with God. Sometimes he leaves us in situations that are bad, okay? There's no two ways about it. But he knows if he intervenes, then we'll be worse off in the future because of it, because we need that strength to endure what is coming down the road for us in the future. From our perspective, it can be a tough pill to swallow for sure, but it is just the nature of living in a fallen world. We see godless people all around us. You don't have to do any more than just turn on the news any night. Seems like they're living carefree without, care in the world, and we just ask God why. Why do you allow these people to flourish and people who are trying to serve you are just struggling? But do we think that God isn't working on strengthening those other people? He's working on strengthening us, so he's giving us the harder path sometimes to take. And so he knows those people. He knows who's going to come to faith and who won't. So maybe he knows they're never going to serve him anyway, so he's not going to strengthen them to go against his will. Through the lack of adversity, their spirituality is going to remain very weak then. And back to Mark, though, it says, as soon as they got out of the boat, the people recognized Jesus. Once they saw him, you would have expected, this is the first time that they saw Jesus in the flesh. They weren't saying, who is this guy? They were flocking towards him. And you wonder, how can that be? How did they know about him? Well, first of all, it should be like that with us. People should see Jesus through us without actually seeing him. They should see the way that we act and live and so forth, and see Christ in us for the first time. There are times when I've met people and I just think there's something different. I can almost guarantee you that person is a Christian. I've met people like that in my life before, because the light of Jesus just shines through certain people, and it's undeniable, and it should be undeniable if he's in your heart. Now, these people, they recognize Jesus, and we'll get to that. They're bringing their sick to him for healing as well. It's not just, I heard about this guy, but I heard about what this guy can do for us. And so, Jesus, if we look at what he actually did here, there's another lesson to be learned. He fed the multitude yesterday. Then he walks on water overnight. And lastly, he goes and heals people. Well, what does all that mean? He took care of the basic human needs first. And this is one of those things that in seminary and Bible school, they ask you a whole lot of questions, put you through all sorts of testing and everything. And one situation I remember they asked me is, if you are working at a church and homeless people come to your church and they're looking for a warm meal, they said, what do you do first? Do you find a way to give them a meal? Or do you show them, pull out a Bible first and show them the way? That kind of a thing. People will answer that differently, but the idea is, in my mind, a person needs to get that physical need addressed first, because they aren't in the right frame of mind to receive the good news. So that's how I answered it, and they were satisfied with that, I guess. Doesn't mean you just send them on their way. Then you do what you can from that point. That's what missionaries deal with every single day when they go to these places where the living conditions are really bad. And what they do is they want to make sure that person is comfortable for the day. They don't have to worry about where's my next meal coming from. It puts them in a better state of mind, typically, to receive the gospel. And some people, like I said, deal with that every single day. Now, when we look at these verses in Mark 6, at the end, it might actually ring a bell when you read it the whole way through, which we don't have that luxury here this morning. But it said they begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed. Does that ring a bell somewhere from somewhere else in the Bible? There was a woman in Mark 5, just last chapter, if you were reading it through, she had an issue of blood for many years. And it was a situation where a large crowd was pressing in, and they wanted Jesus, and they wanted healing, and his disciples are there, and the woman, I think she gets down on her knees, and she just says, if I could just touch the edge of his cloak, then I know that I could be healed. And Jesus felt power rush out of him, and he says something to the disciples, and they're thinking, yeah, there's like hundreds of people here, of course somebody's touching you, and they didn't get what he was saying. And so then they found out that it was this woman and so forth. Apparently, that story spread like wildfire. How else could these people in Gennesaret know that just by touching the edge of his cloak, which actually was probably almost like little tassels hanging down from his robe? The typical Jewish man at the time, who was a rabbi like Jesus, they would wear this thing, and it's not even touching your skin, touching your shirt. It might have been just something dangling here. And who's going to notice that when you're in a big marketplace or something with hundreds of people? Yet he felt power rush out of him, and these people in Gennesaret thought, this is our guy. I mean, if I can even get that close to just touch that edge, then that could change my life for sure. And Jesus does change lives in drastic ways every single day. he felt power radiate out of him here. Imagine what he does over the last 2,000 years since then. Imagine the excitement that all of these people felt, thinking, I can get near the guy who can actually heal me. And it wasn't just them. The important thing, too, is that they were not selfish about it either. I'm sure if they needed healing, they got their healing. But it says they went and they got other sick people and brought them to Jesus as well. That is how we should be with our relationship with Jesus. So excited about what he can do for us, what he has done for us, and so forth, that we want to tell everyone that we can. Bring them to Jesus, of course, not in the physical sense, but that is how selfless these people were, and it sets the example for us too. I've heard it said this way before, and it sounds rather, I'm not sure what the word is, it sounds rather harsh maybe, but I think that it's legitimate. And somebody said, how much do you have to hate somebody in order to know that there's a cure and not tell them about it? And I can't really disagree with that, really. That's why we should do whatever we can to tell as many people about Jesus as we can. Do what we ought to so that they find their way to the cross. There are no doubt people in our church, maybe even the ones here this morning, who are in need of healing. And healing, we automatically think physical, but I always say it's spiritual, financial, relational, all those kind of things, emotional even. Bring it to the cross. Reach out, spiritually speaking, and touch that cloak of the shepherd. As often is the case in the Bible, we see stories of literal events take place, but that's rarely all that there is to it. There's almost always something beneath the surface. There's often a spiritual application from the story. And when Mark wrote the gospel in Greek, by the way, he used a word that is sozo. I don't even know any word that it translates to, but that's what it is. When he says Jesus healed the multitudes, he did it with sozo, or by sozo. That means to heal, which can be used for physical healing, but can also be used to talk about being saved from divine judgment. Same exact word here. So just as Jesus healed their physical ailments, Jesus also heals our spiritual ailments. And oftentimes that's even more significant than the physical ones. However, like those in Gennesaret, you typically have to come to him to get the healing. So we're actually going to be done earlier, which isn't bad, but not going to waste unnecessary time just rambling and rattling on. Just I want you to take with you from here that if this is you, or if you know somebody who this applies to, don't be shy about lifting up your needs to Jesus. Oftentimes people look at God like he's too busy, he has 7 billion people to worry about and so forth. It's not like that at all. Jesus cared about this one woman who had an issue of blood, and she didn't even want to get his attention, yet he knew that she was there trying to get healing. We need to get in the habit of laying our needs at the foot of the cross and leave them there. Don't be worrying about them, which is difficult for us to do. But that's what God invites us to do. And while we are there at the foot of the cross, laying our needs there, reach out for the cloak of the shepherd, grab onto it, grab on to those tassels, whatever you can, and do not let go. And it will change your life in drastic ways, even more than you ever thought possible. So let's bow our heads and close with a word of prayer.